I am going on an adventure next Thursday, in fact, and it is to Switzerland. And so I'm pretty excited about this. So this is how it worked. My wife went on a trip to Turkey last year. She'd always wanted to go on this special tour with a friend of Turkey and these key sites over there. And anyway, she did that, and then very just shortly after her return, I had a really good mate who's an excellent cyclist, and he said, I'm turning 50 next year. And he said, I want to do this mountain bike event in Switzerland, but I need a partner for it. And anyway, my wife was there and she was overheard this, and she said, oh, if you wanted to go and do that, I've just gone to Turkey, that would be fine. And I'm like, really? And then so anyway, without any further research, I said, great idea, sign me up. And it turns out another friend of mine, he's turning 60 and he had a partner. So there's four of us going. It was only after that I signed up and agreed to this thing that I discovered a little more about what it was all about. And what it involves is a whole lot. Let's see if I can get my screen going. A whole lot of this. In Australia, we don't really have mountains, so to speak, and compared to what you see over in some of these European countries and other parts of the world. But what I quickly got on, and it turned out it's not actually a one-day event, it's a 5-day event. And it's about 400 kilometers over those 5 days. And over the course of the week, it's like riding to the top of Mount Everest and a half again. So like there's this huge amounts of climbs. This is just one of they show the course profile, and I just had to clutch my chest when I saw. So this is day 3. So this is the middle stage. And you can see that really pointy part. That's a really, really high and very, very steep mountain. And you can see, I think the pass there is like over 2,600 meters, which for our American friends is probably around about 9,000-ish feet, I'd say, somewhere. So anyway, so it's not going to be just long and hard. I'm also cycling with a friend my friend that's turning 50, who is an exceptionally good cyclist and a really, really good hill climber. And so here I am as his partner. We're meant to be within 100 meters of each other the whole time. It's going to be challenging. So yeah, a holiday? No, probably not quite the best terminology for it. It's going to be a really challenging event. So I've taken a great interest of late in how to ride up hills, because there's going to be a lot of that going on. And what I've discovered from in theory and in practice now is there are 2 ways to get from A to B, right? So, and A being the bottom of the hill, being the top of the hill. And they are, you can either pedal in a really high gear, like this fellow he's doing here, really hard, push hard, goes pretty quick, well, if you can sustain it, but you actually get to the top of the hill in this high gear. Or another technique is to actually get a very low gear. And so basically it's almost like your legs are spinning. And so you're not taking, not pushing that hard, but lots of rotations. And inevitably you wind up in the exact same spot from A to B. And, I've been thinking a lot about this as it relates to behavior change. Because, when we talk about, improving some aspect of our well-being, it often involves getting from A to B. There's some sort of behavior change journey in the process. And how can you approach that? Well, there's sort of 2 ways you could do it. You could either do like a massive dive in, push some really high gears, a really immersive kind of radical change. So that would be one way to do it. And it might even get you there quicker in the first instance. It might not keep you there, the research is showing, but it might be a way to get you there quick. The other technique is that you could actually just make small changes. And these small changes, and we could even call them things like tiny habits, would eventually, might take a longer period of time, but get you to the same spot. Now, there's a researcher, and you may have come across his work, and I used the name of his book, Tiny Habits, just a moment there. And he's a Stanford researcher, BJ Fogg. And I think what he's done in the motivational and behavior change space is really quite insightful and helpful. And this is his little theory. So he actually has this sort of actually it looks like an equation, and we won't bore you with that because you might not like maths. But essentially what he says is that if you think about changing a behavior or doing something new, you've actually got 2 key variables that to play with. Number one is how motivated you are to do it. Okay, and sometimes our motivation levels can be pretty high for something. Sometimes they can be low for something. And motivation levels, they do tend to fluctuate a fair bit. And that's an important point to keep in mind. The second variable that we have to work with is our ability to actually do it, whether it's easy for us or whether it's hard for us to do. And what he actually has is this little, you can see this little graph here, what it represents is your likelihood of being able to actually follow through on this in the long term. Okay. And this is what he says. If you have something that you're trying to do that's difficult for you, right? So this is a big new thing. Okay. The motivation required, to do a difficult thing is actually really high, right? In order to get you to act on that, you need high levels of motivation to do a hard thing, right? That sort of goes without saying. And you can sort of see the problem here then, if you're doing hard things and you're wanting to do hard things that are hard in an ongoing manner, it's going to require a lot of sustained motivation at a high level. And that's a challenging thing to do because motivation, I don't know if you've experienced this, but me as a human, I've noted this, motivation levels go up and down. You know, we can get excited about something and then, oh, there's other competing interests now and it becomes more challenging. At the other end of the spectrum, instead of if we were doing something difficult, what about if we were doing something super easy? All right. So, for example, let's think of an example of this. Difficult might be running a marathon. If you had to muster the motivation to run a marathon tomorrow, I imagine that you're going to have a huge amount of motivation going in your favor and probably a huge amount of leverage to do it. But what about instead of running a marathon, we talked about walking one lap of an oval? Then all of a sudden that's probably easy for you to do, or relatively a lot easier. So how much motivation would be required to actually follow through on that? Well, it's probably low, right? You actually, even on a day, if you're not feeling that great or that way inclined, and there are other things going on, you could probably still muster the motivation to walk one lap of the oval. And so he has this really interesting little continuum, and this is where his whole argument lands. He actually says, often when we talk about behavior change and adopting a new well-being habit, where people think, oh, I'm going to make this huge cataclysmic change, all right? And that's the way to get there. And you know what? Maybe that works for you, and maybe it might get you to that destination quick, but will you sustain that? Will you be able to follow through that in the long term? Probably not, unless you're some motivational machine that, that I'm not. So what his argument is that, hey, you know what? Maybe a better approach, to get from A to B is instead of taking huge bites, maybe just start with something really small. Something so simple, so tiny even, that's why he calls it a tiny habit, that, it's just almost a no-brainer to do. It doesn't require you to muster much motivation at all to get above that line and be able to follow through on that. And what his argument is that when you do that, you've had a little bit of success, right? And what that does is make you feel a bit more confident in your ability, increases your self-efficacy, and we know that actually can start to get this momentum going. Often the saying I often have is, how do you get on a roll? Well, you start rolling. And often it's that first little part of the momentum, getting the momentum, that's the most challenging. And so I'm intrigued by this, this whole idea of what is the best way to adopt a new habit? What's the best way to adopt a new behavior? Maybe it's not about trying to do the huge dive in. Maybe it's about just dipping your toe in. Maybe it's just about doing something so small that with great confidence that you can follow through on, even on those days when your motivation might be waning and going up and down, as it does for all of us anyway. And so I think this is an insightful thing, and it's sort of helpful for me because even for training for this particular event, I keep thinking to myself, I know that day one is 85 kilometers. All right. So if I'm going to go for a training ride, if I'm doing less than 50 kilometers, is it going to make any difference? Well, then you start to think 50 kilometers, that's going to take me 2.5 hours. Where do I find 2.5 hours? And plus I have to put all my gear on, and it's just and then it becomes overwhelming. And so what I actually started to do is become more comfortable with the idea that, even if I could just go for a half an hour ride today, it's something, right? It's a small step. And I can, in my brain, I can go, oh yeah, I can do half an hour. I know where I can fit that. And what's interesting to me is that I'll get on the bike and I'll go for that half an hour. And while I'm out there, I'm starting to enjoy it. I've got the momentum going, and all of a sudden I find that I might go for an hour, or if I can squeeze in, even longer than that. And so it's been a really, helpful exercise, I think, for me, thinking along these whole lines of, how can we adopt new habits? Maybe it's with starting small. And through starting small, we can actually arrive at big changes anyway. So that's my thought for this month. And maybe next month, I'll be able to tell you if I made it.